to dig myself a hole to China. I'd like to dig myself a hole to Thailand. I'd like to dig myself a hole to Australia. I'd like to dig myself a hole to Staten Island. I'd like to dig myself a hole to Albuquerque. I'd like to dig myself a hole to Cancun. I'd like to dig myself a hole to the center of the earth. I'd like to dig myself a hole to the moon. I'd like to dig myself a hole to England. I'd like to dig myself a hole to France. I'd like to dig myself a hole into your head. I'd like to dig myself a hole into your pants. I'd like to dig myself a hole somewhere else. I'd like to dig myself a hole to another place. I'd like to dig myself a hole to another time. I'd like to dig myself a hole to outer space. I'd like to dig myself a hole to fortune. I'd like to dig myself a hole to fame. I couldn't dig a hole as well as a mole, but I'd like to dig a hole just the same. I'd like to dig myself a hole into a mansion. I'd like to dig myself a hole into the shore. I'd like to dig myself a hole into the ground. I'd like to dig myself a hole in the floor. I'd like to dig myself a hole in the kitchen to fix myself a sandwich. I'd like to dig myself a hole to some foreign land where everybody speaks a foreign language. I'd like to dig myself a hole in some rocks so I could make myself a cave. I'd like to dig myself a hole in the cemetery and stumble into someone else's grave. I'd like to dig myself a hole around the world. I'd like to dig myself a hole around the sun. It is plain to see that, at least to me, digging holes is lots of fun. I'd like to dig myself a hole out of prison. I'd like to dig myself a hole so I'll be free. If I can't dig a hole that goes that far, at least I'll have a hole where I can pee. I'd like to dig myself a hole. I'd like to dig myself a hole. I'd like to dig myself a hole. I'd like to dig myself a hole.